Shane? Can you hear me, Shane?
Affirmative. We're good, Curtis? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the bonus edition of the Torah Seminar here. And actually, I gave this a little bit of thought, and I thought, this is perfect. It wasn't something that we were initially planning on, but this is a seventh day. And how could you do 6 with all the cycles of 7 from Genesis 1 on? So, yeah, this is perfectly fitting that we should close with the 7th day. All right? Let's go ahead and open up with a word of prayer, shall we? Father, I thank you for the faithfulness of these people. I thank you that actually faithfulness to one another is simply a faint echo of your faithfulness to us all the time. Help us to be mindful of your blessings. Help us not to shrink back in fear, with apathy, with preoccupation and distraction, but help us enter into the fullness of the life that you want us to know. We pray for the glory of Jesus and in his name. Amen. So this last extra session here will be entirely devoted to Deuteronomy. And once again, as with the other sessions, I'd really like it to be as conversational and dialogical as we can make that. Okay? So I came across a meme actually just about a month or so ago. There is safety in numbers. You've all heard that, right? But I prefer Deuteronomy. Okay. So coming right on the heels of the book of Deuteronomy, or on the book of Numbers, it was a journey story, but it was also a pretty depressing book in a lot of ways because it's so much failure and grumbling. God gives promises of blessing, but otherwise there is so little to bless about because they're not being at all obedient. So we move on into Deuteronomy, and what has transpired is that this is now 40 years later. So as we saw at the end of Numbers, the people were not allowed to enter into the land because of their refusal to put their trust in Yahweh. Moses and Aaron are not going to be allowed to enter the land because of failure to trust in Yahweh. So they have now done 40 years' time. During that time, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, all of their other peers have died in the wilderness. There's now no one left who has, with their own eyes, seen the miracles that God did in delivering the Israelites out of Egypt as an adult. Okay. So maybe the best way to start is actually just start reading the first few verses here in Deuteronomy. It says, "These are the words Moses spoke to all Israel in the desert across the Jordan, that is, in the Arabah," it simply means desert region, "opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Lavan, Hatzerot, Dizhav. It takes 11 days to go from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir road." Right, so here we have a time clock running here. From the time that they left Sinai, it took them 11 days to get up to Kadesh Barnea, which is where they sent the 12 spies up. So presumably, it's 11 days after their encounter with God at Sinai. They're standing on the very borders that they're supposed to, of the land that they're supposed to occupy. In the 40th year, did you see what just happened there? Yeah. These are the punishments. So it's now the 40th year. We're jumping ahead these 40 years now. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses proclaimed to the Israelites all that Yahweh had commanded him concerning them. This was after he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, and at Edrei had defeated Og, king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth. We didn't actually talk about those stories in our last session in Numbers, but these are two peoples who lived just on the perimeter of the promised land that they're supposed to occupy. And God had already defeated a couple of these major armies already. But they were still in a holding pattern. They had to wait that 40 years. Okay. Verse 5. Across the Jordan, in the territory of Moab, remember Moab was that place where Balak was the king, who hired the contract hitman prophet Balaam to come put a curse on them, and he was prevented from cursing them by Yahweh himself. Right, they're now in that territory. It's also the place where in Numbers 25 there's this awful apostasy and unfaithfulness toward God with idolatry and adultery and all kinds of other perverse behaviors. Okay? That's where they're at. Moses began to expound this L-A-W. And how do we pronounce L-A-W? Torah. And what does it mean? Instruction. And I think that this is actually one of the clearest evidences that it has to mean instruction rather than law. He started to explain the Torah. Yahweh our God said to us at Horeb, "You've stayed here long enough at this mountain. Break camp and advance in the hill country of the Amorites. Go to the neighboring peoples in the Arabah, the mountains, in the western foothills of the Negev, along the coast, to the land of the Canaanites." Verse 8, "See, I've given you this land. Go in and take possession of the land that Yahweh swore he would give to your fathers." Verse 9, "At that time I said to you, you're too heavy a burden for me to carry alone." Verse 14, "You answered me, what you propose to do is good." Verse 15, "So I took the leading men of your tribes." What kind of literature is this? Narrative, poetry, or discourse? Verse 14, verse 15, what is that? Is that? It's conversation. Conversations take place in what kind of literature? Narrative, yeah. So let's see if it reads like narrative. Verse 19. "Then, as Yahweh our God commanded us, we set out from Horeb and went toward the hill country of the Amorites." Narrative? Yeah. Verse 22, "Then you came to me and said," verse 26, "but you were unwilling to go up, you rebelled." Verse 29, "Then I said to you," verse 32, "in spite of all this, you did not believe in, trust in Yahweh your God." Verse 37, "Because of you, Yahweh became angry with me also." Verse 43, so I told you, but you wouldn't listen. You rebelled against Yahweh's command." What kind of literature? Narrative, yeah. "Then we turned back," chapter 2, verse 1, "and set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea." What type of literature? Still narrative. Verse 14, 38 years passed from the time that we left Kadesh Barnea. Still narrative. Chapter 3, verse 1. Next we turned and went up along the road toward Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan. Narrative. Verse 8. So at that time we took from these two kings of the Amorites the territories east of the Jordan. Verse 12. Of the land that we took over at the time, I gave the Reubenites and the Gadites the territory north. Verse 21, at that time I commanded Joshua. Verse 26, but because of you, Yahweh was angry with me. This is all narrative, isn't it? How does Moses expound the Torah? He talks about the story. He talks about the narrative. Now look what happens in verse 4. Or chapter 4, yeah. Hear now, O Israel, the decrees, chukim, and my NIV says laws, the mishpatim, the regulations, I am about to teach you. He hasn't given them any of those commandments yet. Follow them so that you may live and may go in and take possession of the land that Yahweh, the God of your fathers, is giving you. Do not add to what I command you, and do not subtract, but keep the commandments of Yahweh your God that I give you. You saw with your own eyes what Yahweh did at Baal Peor. Remember I told you to pay attention to that? That's that really bad place of apostasy. Verse 6. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nation. You will hear about the decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Verse 9, only be careful. Watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them slip from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. Remember the day you stood before Yahweh your God at Horeb. All right. Once again, down in 426, I call heaven and the land as witnesses against you this day. Verse 27, Yahweh will scatter you among the peoples, and only a few of you will survive. This is if they're disobedient. Okay. Then we get down to chapter 5, and we have the repetition of the Ten Commandments and the whole next big section of the book, which contains all of these commandments. So let me read just a little bit from the beginning of 6. These are the mitzvot, the commandments, the chukim, the decrees, and the mishpatim, the precepts, the regulations. Yahweh your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land you're crossing the Jordan to possess. Verse 3, hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as Yahweh, the God of your fathers, promised you. And then what is frequently called the Shema, which is the first word of the next verse. Hear. But this is a matter of not just kind of auditorially receiving it, but rather willingly complying with it. Attend to. Listen, O Israel. Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them upon your children. Talk about them. When you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. I don't know why, but it always pops into my head. When you jump down, turn around, pick a bale of cotton. Everything that you do, you are to do so, teaching your children This is how we do everything. It's been talked about in Leviticus. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. So among Orthodox Jews, they practice that right down to today. So they will actually have what are called phylacteries, where they have the Shema, this passage, in a little box on the forehead and a little box on their wrist, and around the door of the frame, the entrance of the house. Maybe you've seen some of these. Is a mezuzah, where they also have this same passage. And proper respect and protocol is you kiss your hand, you touch it. Whenever you leave, you touch it and you kiss it to show reverence. But, of course, we as Christians think, no, you're missing the point. It's not about actually literally wearing the things. This is a figure of speech. May Torah affect your mind, your thinking. May it affect the work of your hands. And may it affect everything within your household as you are training and rearing your children in the ways of God. Right? And so we kind of look with a little bit of contempt upon these Jews who have over-literalized things until we get to the book of Revelation, where we think someday in the future there's going to be the mark of the beast on our foreheads, on our hands, and it's going to be like laser imprinted, and they'll even explain to you all the different technologies that are probably going to be used. And we're committing exactly the same error. Okay? Your thinking, your handwork. All right, so I wanted to bring all of this out to say that the explanation of the Torah was narrative. And then he shifts gears and he says, now, here are the commandments. Here are the laws I give to you. Listen and obey. Okay? Does Torah mean law? No, in this case, Torah means the opposite of law. It's the narrative that is giving us the context for all of these regulations. Okay, any questions so far or observations? Okay. So I've called this forgetting to remember, not to forget. I phrased it that way because there are both of these phrases that are used repeatedly throughout Deuteronomy. Do not forget. Remember. G.K. Chesterton once pointed out that Christians of his day are amnesiacs. We don't remember who we are in Christ. And if that were true back in the 1940s when he was alive and writing, it's only more so today. Okay? We are a forgetful people. So, the book of Deuteronomy is a covenant. Cool. What's a covenant? So, we need to understand a little bit about covenants. That for many scholars, the way that we find out about, and I don't find that helpful hardly at all. The suzerain treaties of the ancient Hittites, to me, are not similar so much as they are totally different. The outward form is somewhat the same, but the content is completely different. Right? So, what is a covenant? A covenant is a formal legal agreement between two parties. Features include stipulations that each side agrees to. I'll do this, you do that. Okay? It can be, I do all of this work, you pay me this much. Or it can be goods in exchange for goods. It can be any number of things, but covenants have stipulations, conditions. There's always the presence of witnesses and the formalizing of the agreement. Today, a signature is used in purchasing a house or a car, and as soon as you write your signature, get it notarized, it becomes an official document that's binding, and you are now bound to it. And if you don't keep the stipulations, you then can be sued for breach of contract. In the Bible, it's typically a verbal oath, often with a blood sacrifice that goes along with it. The blood sacrifice is mostly just an enactment of what's going to happen to you if you mess with me on your side of the covenant. Okay? See this bull that we've just cut in half? May it be to you if you don't keep your side. It's a very serious thing to do. These agreements may involve one human with another, or Yahweh with humans. Jacob and Laban had to enter into a covenant, but mostly because neither of them trusted the other. Remember what Laban did to Jacob? Jacob worked for him for 7 years, and then he gives him the wrong daughter. Right? So Laban owed Jacob big time. On the other hand, Jacob himself was kind of a dirty dealer in the way that he managed the flocks, ensuring that he would get way more of the flocks that belonged to Laban, to get more of those for himself. So finally they end up striking a covenant between the two. I can't remember the precise wording of that, but I find it really kind of humorous that sometimes there are couples who will wear this little pendant that has, may the Lord keep watch over you. What's that? Yeah, may the Lord watch between you and me. And half the pendant will be worn by one person, half the pendant is worn by the other, not realizing that it was an indication of distrust of one another. Yahweh is going to keep his eye on you. Don't you forget it, buddy. All right. Not as romantic as it might at first seem when it was sitting there in a Bible bookstore. All right. Okay. So it can involve one human with another, or it can be Yahweh and human beings. But if it's Yahweh and human beings, it's never initiated by the human party. It's got to be initiated by God. And we consent and comply, or we fall prey, if you want to call it that, to the consequences, the curses. Right? Again, any questions here? Yeah. Wes.
I have a question on the topic of covenants.
Yeah.
And the meaning from, I think Abraham and Joseph both use the phrase, put your hand under my thigh and swear.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered what the significance of that means, and if we know outside of the Bible or even inside, what is the point of that? What are they saying?
All right. It might strike us as being a little TMI, a little too much information here, a little too explicit, at least an R-rated section here. But sticking your hand right beside the organs of regeneration, procreation, and I think it's signaling this is of such consequence. We do wrong by this other person in that kind of a I get that only from the text, and I'm not trying to get this from some kind of, Akkadian custom or something like that. Anyone else? Okay. So the book of Deuteronomy is a covenant, as I mentioned. But what does that look like? And really, the outline of the book is a covenant form. So it starts off with a preamble, giving the date and the immediate circumstances, and when does it start. And that's given in the first few verses. And then the historical prologue, and I kind of talked us through the first 4 chapters. So here is the historical situation in which this covenant was initially made. And that's what we see then in Deuteronomy 1 through 4. And then we have the treaty stipulations, and look at all the chapters here. Chapters 5 through 26, a big block of discourse. Right? But notice that it was preceded by narrative. And once again, we're seeing the white part surrounded by a blue background. The narrative is the context for the giving of commandments, what each side agrees to. And then here are the specifics of the consequences. If you keep the covenant, this is what's going to happen. If you don't keep the covenant, here's what's going to happen. Punishments for the breach, benefits of obedience. So in 27 and 28, we have the blessings and the curses. If you remember back to the very first session, I took the time to read the entirety of Leviticus 26. Right? This is the same thing now to the next generation, except it's even longer. More blessings offered. More punishments that are laid out there. Okay? With even a stipulation that says, when you get into the land, divide all the people up into 2 teams. And they should go up into adjacent mountains. And these mountains are Gerizim and Ebal. Out west here in the United States, whether in Hawaii or really from the Rockies on west, mountains are so big, they're so far apart, you could never hope to hear from one to the next. So if you're standing on the top of Mount St. Helens and yelling north, nobody on the top of Mount Rainier is going to hear you, or vice versa. Okay? That's the Cascades. But these mountains are nowhere near as tall, and they're much closer together. Okay? So they're supposed to yell back and forth. And the team that is on Mount Ebal, yells out the curses. And the team on Mount Gerizim yell out the blessings. So it goes back and forth, and they're talking to each other. as in conversation. And hopefully it's such a powerful graphic visual of their two choices that by the end of all of that, you would hope that everybody on Mount Ebal would say, we don't want to be on this side. Let's all go over to Gerizim, to the blessed side. Okay, if they're only thinking straight, right? Okay, so we have the blessings and the curses. And then provision for the reading of the treaty before witnesses, both initially and in an ongoing basis for succeeding generations. And then there is something else that doesn't fit a covenant form. An interruption in 29 and 30, and then in 31 through 34. So yes, we're going to have to pay special attention to those particular chapters to see why they would intrude their way into an otherwise really clear covenant form. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? She just asked what was number 2. It was the historical prologue. Good. Tamara. Well, hang on a second.
Do you want to talk about at all the difference between a covenant and a contract?
Well, I could only insofar as to say that a contract can be made between any two parties, and it can be very dispassionate. I mean, if you're hiring somebody to put in a new septic tank in your backyard, whether or not you like the person doesn't really matter. And from their point of view, as long as you pay the money, they don't have to like you either, right? But in a covenant in the Bible, it typically signifies a deeper, in fact, a family relationship. So a marriage is called a covenant. You don't have to have a covenant with your bio children because it's assumed that they are your family. You will accept the responsibilities of being a parent and doing what is best for them to nurture them. Okay? But if they're not a bio kid, then they would need to be brought into the family as adoptees through a covenant. And that's actually the same as it is here in our jurisprudence today. So you have to sign letters of agreement and promises to various parties in order to adopt a child. But you don't have to do that with a birth certificate. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. So, what are the themes of Deuteronomy? One very important theme that I just mentioned is remember and don't forget. The word remember is found 16 times. The phrase do not forget another 12 times. Clearly, this is something very important for the Israelites to do. But it's important that it gets passed along from generation to generation. If they forget the story of their origins and being brought out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm by Yahweh's strength through the 10 plagues on the Red Sea and the covenant at Sinai, if they forget their moorings, then they will be adrift in a sea of Canaanites and will increasingly become like them, being assimilated into the practices of those surrounding peoples. They will lose their identity. And so kind of jumping ahead and getting a little practical here, this is a really, really important exercise that we as Christians ought regularly to be engaging in. Every time we take communion, we are told to do so in remembrance of Him, in remembrance of the covenant made by His blood and body with us for our benefit. I had a former teacher, the name might ring a bell with some of you. His name was Bruce Wilkinson of Walk Through the Bible. And he taught for a couple of years at Multnomah. And he was sharing with us that just because of the ministry of Walk Through the Bible, he got to rub shoulders with many of the top leaders of various ministries at that time. Billy Graham, Dawson Trotman of the Navigators, Bill Bright of Campus Crusade, some of the really top leaders, the real movers and shakers in ministries of around the 70s. And he was looking for patterns. What is the lifestyle that all of these difference makers all seem to share in common? And he had everything from what seemed like the most trivial to very powerful and significant patterns, looking for these, again, the commonalities. And he couldn't find any. Do you get up early? Do you stay up late? How many kids do you have? What kind of a car do you drive? How often do you confess sin? Lots and lots and lots of questions. And he didn't see any discernible pattern until he had a thunderclap moment. And that is whenever he asked them just to describe the things that God had done in their life, he could hardly get them to stop. They would go on and on and on and on about sharing the stories. Not about how remarkable they were. In fact, just the opposite. How remarkable God was to them. And his conclusion was, the one thing that they have in common is a good memory. But not to memorize words on a page. It was a good memory to recall the blessings of God in their lives. And I think that that's actually something for each one of us to take. In Romans 12 it says, I urge you therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your logikos, which is the only logical thing to do. Why is it logical? Because of the mercies of God. And I think that's the phrase that we often kind of skim by too quickly. That is, it's the mercies of God that should motivate us to want to be a sacrifice. Because if you stop and think about it, why would you want to sacrifice your life at the beginning of a day, for instance? Why would anybody do that? Well, do you remember last time you fully yielded yourself to God? It might have felt like shortly thereafter you went through some hard times. Frequently that happens. But there is a time when, as you do so, you just feel like you and God are intimately close. Do you remember what that felt like? Do you remember the ways in which God has been merciful such that he answered a prayer that you weren't sure that you could even utter, that you had enough faith to utter that kind of a prayer? Ever been there? Ever been in a context of people that you just sense were all worshiping with all of their hearts simultaneously? That is way cooler than any rock concert. Have you ever seen a baby brother or sister get born into the kingdom of God right in front of your eyes? There's no fun adventure that you can go on during vacation time that is ever going to match that kind of joy. Life-enriching experience. That's what we need to remember. And rehearse it often enough, enough in our own minds so that when we are facing difficulties, we can draw on this vast reservoir. So actually, after hearing him speak and sharing this particular concept, I decided that I was going to make it practical by, this is kind of pre-computer, by putting a manila folder into my file cabinet, and I just called it discouragement file. And any time I thought of a really remarkable prayer request that had been answered, I would just jot it down and drop it in that folder. And anytime I got a card or a letter from someone indicating how God had spoken to them somehow through something I said and had written me a thank you, I dropped it in the discouragement file. So that when I was feeling just beaten up by life, I could go back and review those and give me a sense of perspective. Well, that's a pattern that I started, 40 years ago. That single file folder is really big and really fat. And I still keep dropping things in there on a regular basis. I don't think that I have looked at it in years. The reason is that as soon as I even think about the file, I already am aware of what I'm going to learn. And that is, there's no place I would rather be than in fellowship with God. And there's no better way on my end for that to happen than for me, once again, to put my body back up there on the altar. As has been pointed out, the problem with a living sacrifice is that it keeps wanting to crawl off the altar. So we all have that propensity, and it's only a matter of time before we go jumping off and wanting to do our own thing. But again, I hope that it becomes more and more kind of my residence is on top of that altar, living in a way that is sacrificing for him, so that my body, such as it is completely his. Okay. Questions or thoughts or reflections on your part? Okay. Okay, remember, don't forget. Right. So, what am I supposed to not forget to remember? from Deuteronomy. Remember to be loyal all the time in covenant relationship. The word love, either chesed or more frequently ahav, is used 34 times in the book of Deuteronomy, and the word heart, lev, is found 25 additional times. And this is why I don't find ancient Hittite treaties to be of any benefit in reading the Bible, because this is an element that is absent altogether from ancient treaties, and yet it's at the absolute core, or if you will, it's at the heart of Deuteronomy. There's no way that you can compel somebody else to love you. And yet God says, I will give you my love, my loyalty. And in return, I expect that same kind of love, fidelity, commitment to relationship. In our legal codes, at the city level or at the state level or at the national level, read through those law books if you want to. Hundreds of volumes, many tens of thousands of pages, and you're not going to find the language of love. You're going to find the language of laws. So is Deuteronomy about love or about laws? And the downbeat, especially in the narrative framing, is love. But even in the commandments over and over again, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Also, as an aspect of remembering to be loyal, Yahweh's people are to worship Yahweh, but Him alone. You shall have no other gods before me. And again, this is represented here on earth most powerfully through the love of husband and wife for a lifetime. When that is the case, then there is something that is reflecting the heart of God for His people. And we are to love Yahweh and also others. Love Yahweh your God with all your heart, all your soul, with all your strength. Know, therefore, that Yahweh your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping His covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love Him and keep His commands. Now, the first part of that sounds very much like what we heard in Exodus 34 and was also repeated in the book of Numbers in 14. And now here we see it again in Deuteronomy to the next generation. He is faithful. He will always keep His side of the covenant. So in one of the most poignant stories that we see in the book of the 12, or the so-called minor prophets in Hosea, we see Israel being depicted as an unfaithful wife, and Hosea as a faithful husband representing God. And though the wife becomes unfaithful, and the husband has every right to disengage from that covenant relationship because it's already been broken, instead, he remains faithful, which is a picture of God. Even with those who are rebellious and defiant, He keeps working and keeps working and keeps loving.
What's the difference between ahav and chesed? I was thinking that you said in the past that chesed is the covenant unfailing love. But if we're talking about covenants, why is he using ahav, and what's the difference between the two of them?
Yeah. Two different Hebrew words. Ahav, really, I think, is well translated with our English word love. It can be used for a for a breadth of relationships. But chesed is specifically covenant fidelity, steadfastness, hanging in there when things might get most difficult. That's chesed. And ahav doesn't have to have covenant in place. So we love our neighbors with ahav. We wouldn't chesed, covenant fidelity, with our neighbors unless a covenant has been made of some sort with them. Okay. This is a covenant. So there's both ahav that God has for people, but there's also fidelity. And I wish that chesed actually wasn't translated love. I think it confuses the matter. It's just covenant loyalty. Some Bibles will use steadfast love in translation, but the real emphasis is on loyalty. Corey?
I got a question to the Shema, especially verse 5, and how it's quoted in the New Testament in Mark and Luke. They add like a fourth thing in there. So heart, soul, strength, and they add mind in there.
Yeah.
How'd that get inserted in there? Do you know?
No, I don't, and I'm curious about it. I've noticed that as well. Certainly God wants us to love him with all that we are and all that we have. Maybe it's to help all of those from the Western world who would be succeeding generations. And I know of people who live divided lives where they have their work and academic life as separate from their spiritual walk. So much so that they'll say, what I do on my job is not an influence in any way by whether I have faith. I remember reading a quote to that effect by a person who was fairly high up, this is quite some time ago, in one of the major networks, in overseeing programming. And he was asked about how can you be a Christian in that role, and he just said, when I am doing my work, I don't see how my spiritual life would relate to that. And that's a kind of double-mindedness, or a kind of spiritual schizophrenia that we've got to be rid of. We need to love him with all of our minds as well. Other observations or questions here? Okay. Also, we need to remember God's instructions on how to live well. And as we saw in Leviticus, that means every area of life. We need to live more skillfully. And maybe that's one of the better ways of thinking about the term wisdom. There are some people who are good at baseball. There are some people who are good at art. And there are some people who are just good at life. And I'm not talking there about measuring that according to the standards of material goods, but rather they have relationships across the board that seem really healthy. Right? In fact, let me comment on that a little bit further. Recommend a book to you. There's a guy by the name of David Brooks. He's a regular columnist for the New York Times. Comes from a privileged, educated, white, male background, and made a quest around the middle of his life to discover what character is really all about. And so in his pursuit of character, he began reading biographies of many, many notable figures. Again, looking for patterns, looking for similarities. And in the book, he says there are two kinds of sets of virtues, is what he called them. There are resume virtues, which you would put down on a resume in order to earn for yourself a job. Here's my accomplishments. And then he says there are eulogy virtues, which is what people will say about your character at your funeral. And he said for the first half of his life, it was all about resume building. And only in the middle of his life did he realize that's not where it's at. It's all about building eulogy characteristics that can actually be transferred then onto other people. Very thoughtful writer. Yeah.
I got a quick question on the Hebrew word wisdom. It's hokmah.
Yeah.
Is that any way similar to the Hebrew word for statutes, which is hukim, I think?
No
relation.
I don't think that they are related, but boy, now that you mention it, they sure sound an awful lot alike. I tell you what, just as a little bit of an aside here for a moment, let me show you something interesting in Proverbs. Doesn't directly relate to your question, but it does. Well, there's just something cool in Proverbs that has to do with wisdom. So you remember the Shema, Hear, O Israel, Yahweh your God, Yahweh is one, followed up by love the Lord your God, and then you're to teach them to your children. Remember, tie them to your foreheads as you walk along the road, as you lie down, and so forth. Look at Proverbs chapter 3, verse 1. My son, do not forget my... You ready for this? Do not forget my Torah. At least most Bibles here correctly translated as instruction or teaching. Right? But keep my commands in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years and bring you prosperity. Let chesed, covenant loyalty, and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Doesn't that sound a little bit like, around the doorpost and so forth? Right. Go a little bit further. Just a moment, I want to check something. Okay. Chapter 6, verse 20. My son, keep your father's commands and do not forsake your mother's Torah. That's surprising, isn't it? Bind them on your heart forever. Fasten them around your neck. When you walk, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. When you are awake, they will speak to you. So we're seeing a really interesting move here from written commandments to the spoken Torah given by dad and mom. Okay. There's a lot more I could say about that, but I'll just give you a heads up on it.
Through studying Proverbs like a year or so ago, that got me wondering, is there any connection with those words? Because, I don't know, you see commandment and statutes mentioned alongside Torah and then wisdom. So, yeah.
Yeah, so one is a narrower term, the other one is broader. And the narrower term would be commands, and the other would be instruction. Yeah. Any others? Okay. They must worship Yahweh in the place he chooses. Be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings anywhere you please. Offer them only at the place Yahweh will choose. So if you decided to offer a sacrifice to God, you couldn't go out to the backyard barbecue pit and just offer an animal on your own terms. There was only one place where there were acceptable sacrifices, and that was in the tabernacle, which was then replaced by the temple. Which means that any time there's a sacrifice offered after they get into the land that was offered in some other place, it then became a defiance of God rather than a yielding of God. Now, with the exception of offered in the place that God designated. So, you remember when Saul ends up in chapter 15 capturing the king of the Amalekites, killing off the armies, but taking as plunder all the livestock. And then he's called out for that, for not waiting until Samuel arrived. Samuel says, "What's that I hear in the background?" And Saul says, that's the livestock that I was planning to use for sacrifices. Besides the fact he was flat out lying, he also couldn't offer those as sacrifices unless they were all herded from the area of Amalek all the way back to Jerusalem. Right? And this is before train cars and cattle trucks and things like that. When the kingdom is split in two, Solomon's son Rehoboam, who was a really stupid, foolish king, provoked the people that the 10 northern tribes split away. The 10 northern tribes had a problem right away, and that is, do you go back to Judah, which is now kind of a competitor country? Do you go there every Sabbath to offer sacrifices? Well, that's not acceptable. So they build two rival temples, one in Gilgal and one in Bethel. And they offer sacrifices to Yahweh. But every single sacrifice was another act of defiance. And far from removing or covering any sins, it simply exacerbated all the sins that they were already committing with yet more. Okay, and finally, the Israelites, who had 0 good kings in all of their history, 0 who were committed fully to trusting Yahweh or leading the people to do the same thing. they end up being taken into captivity. Right before that, the prophets Hosea and Amos say, well, this is in Amos, well then fine, go to Gilgal and sin. Go to Beth Aven and sin yet more. If you're looking on a map, where's Beth Aven? Where's Beth Aven? It's a word play. It is Bethel. But Bethel means the house of God, and Beth Aven means the house of wickedness. So that plays from the very foundations and upon which it was built. It was the place of wickedness, because all the sacrifices there would be reprehensible in God's eyes. Okay. And it's back here in Deuteronomy where this is established. Curtis, my clicker went to sleep. There we go. Also remember God's instruction on how to live well. That is, the king that you have over you is to be devoted to studying and teaching Torah. So let's turn for just a moment to Deuteronomy 17. In verse 14 it says, when you enter the land Yahweh your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you the king Yahweh your God chooses. He must be from among his own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire a great number of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for Yahweh has told you you're not to go that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart, there's that term again, will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Those are the things that he is not supposed to do. Isn't it weird that the job description starts off with, don't let him do this, and he shouldn't be a foreigner, and all those kind of negatives. Finally gets around to, here's what he's supposed to do. When he takes the throne on his kingdom, he is to write out for himself on a scroll a copy of this Torah, taken from that of the priest. By the way, copy of this Torah, when that was translated into Greek in the ancient translation that we call the Septuagint, it was translated with the Greek term Deuteronomus, second nama, second law. And that's where we get the term Deuteronomy, which is unfortunate because it's not just about law. Anyway, he is to make a copy of this Torah, taken from that of the priests who are the Levites. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere Yahweh his God, and follow carefully all the words of this Torah and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers, and turn from the Torah to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. You notice how there is nothing about national policy, about international relationships, foreign policy, about any kind of internal affairs or infrastructure or anything else. He's supposed to be one of the leading experts of all the people in the Torah. Get that part right, everything else is going to work out. Right? Wouldn't that be kind of cool if we decided to mandate something like that for for all of our politicians. Wow. All right, any questions or comments?
I've got one from online, if you can hear me.
You sound like you're talking in an echo chamber.
Let me try something here. I'm going to put an earbud in and try again.
Okay. We're here waiting.
Okay, maybe it's a little better now. I'm not sure.
Yes, much.
Okay, so I was actually thinking about that same scripture before you brought it up and all the things you've been saying. And I wonder if, Hebrews 11 being a New Testament, not exactly an equivalent, but the idea that, hey, we need to remember what God did through, rescuing from Egypt and saving us from the giants in the land and all that other stuff, and Mount Horeb and all that. And then in the New Testament, Hebrews 11, remembering how God used all these people, whether they were sawn in two or whether they became great kings, and their faithfulness, and how that relates to your file folder of God's faithfulness to you personally.
There's a theme of memory or remembering that goes all the way through at least the book of Deuteronomy through the rest of the Bible. So remember, they make memorial stones when they're crossing the Jordan River. They're supposed to be stones of remembrance. The term Ebenezer were the stones of help that God had given. Anything that we can do to help trigger our memory. I had a friend when I was in high school, and he had given his life to Christ as well. And every time he put his keys in the ignition, he took that occasion to pray. Not because he was a particularly bad driver, but it was just another way to remember to be in conversation with God. Another friend who just kept a rock in his pocket all the time, and when he felt the rock, then he would pray. Those kinds of memory things can be helpful. They might not. After a couple of days of having a rock in your pocket, you just kind of forget to pay attention to its significance. But anything we can do to help foster the awareness of the mercies, plural, of God will certainly strengthen us. I see a hand over here. Yeah, Wesley.
So I had a question regarding the issue of a sovereign over Israel, a king. And in this passage, he is saying, when you, ... will say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. I have been taught, but I've wondered, was a king, like a sovereign individual over these people, was that, how do I phrase this? Was that part of God's plan in the, I guess the parallel question would be, or observation would be, if he wanted the firstborn male of every tribe to represent him in their cyclical cycle of priesthood, volunteerism, right? Mm-hmm. And then they screwed that all up. So he said, okay, we're going to single out the Levites because they didn't screw up in a time where that was important. So the original plan was sort of temporarily altered and given to the Levites. Was there ever an original plan for a king, or was this purely like a concession for the people, if that makes sense?
Well, the way that it's phrased, it certainly lets you know that God is aware in advance that what's motivating them to desire a king is so that they could be like the other nations, which is the wrong reasons. But to desire a king is a hope that's been fostered at least since Genesis 49, that the scepter will not depart from between Judah's feet. So desiring a king is not a bad thing. But doing so in order to be like all the nations, that is problematic. And from this passage, it almost makes it sound like the king is king through his lifetime, but there's no succession plan. So it's almost like the people can select who the next king would be. However, in Israel's history, as it plays out, the first one is someone they select. And here, again, I want you to be able to read your Bibles with confidence, but there are times when things just get under-translated somewhat. And most translations will say something along the lines of Saul was, he was handsome. When really the Hebrew is actually saying he was good in their eyes. And that's different from being just good looking, isn't it? Especially when you realize that this is the first king following the book of Judges, when every man did that which was right in his own eyes. All right, so these people collectively have eye problems. And what they think they want and what they really need are radically different things. So he gives them a king who is good in their eyes. That is, he is just like them, except taller. Just a bigger version of every other person there. And that is not a solution to anything, and gets them into big problems. So then Samuel has to go and anoint the next king. And in the anointing of that king, we read the verse, "For man looks on the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks on the heart." So David is anointed, but then during his kingship, God breaks in with a word through Nathan, promising him a perpetual dynasty. So it was now no longer a choice made by the people. It was the eldest son in the line of David from that point forward. Israel, of course, the 10 northern tribes, broke away from that. And so you see all kinds of assassinations and coups and things like that that characterize the northern kingdom.
So a follow-up question, kind of the way you're explaining it is I think is helping me understand. Would you say there's like parallels with Isaac and Ishmael? Like there's a promise, and one of them is like we're going to get it our way, and then problems from that versus like if you would have just held off.
Yeah, and waited for God.
In the plan, just not
right.
You doing it.
Right, exactly.
Is that more accurate?
Yeah, that's a really good way of phrasing it.
Okay.
Now, as a little bit of a PS to Deuteronomy 17, there were three things that he was proscribed, that is, forbidden from doing. One of them was accumulating many horses, especially horses from Egypt. Secondly, accumulating large amounts of gold and silver. And third was accumulating wives who might lead his heart astray. And David's immediate offspring in this dynastic succession is Solomon, who had 12,000 horses, many of which were imported from Egypt, so much so that he even ended up selling Egyptian horses. He went into the Egyptian horse trading business. And as far as money, how much gold did he have? 666 talents of gold annually. And how do you do on the wives? I don't know how to say this any other way, but it is perverse and obscene. 700 wives plus another 300 concubines. It's like he read Deuteronomy 17 and decided to go for the all-time Guinness Book of World Records on how to defy God. I don't expect to see Solomon in heaven because Yahweh was very angry with him at the end of his life. Anyway, that's...
Ray,
Yeah, go ahead.
so, actually kind of touching exactly on that subject, I had a bit of an inquiry in regards to what your thoughts are. With Solomon, obviously he did some pretty large missteps with all of these things. And it would seem to me that the answer to this is kind of comes in even what Wesley just said, and the idea of acquiring this by the way of Yahweh's hand versus trying to do these things on your own, which Solomon obviously had a very large track record of doing. But what are your thoughts on the fact that obviously in Deuteronomy 17 we see here that they're not supposed to acquire much gold for themselves, and that's what Solomon did. But what God promises him when he first visits him in his dream, and Solomon asks solely at that time just for wisdom to be able to rule the realm wisely, and God says, I will give you that, and on top of that, I'll give you riches beyond what you can imagine, essentially.
Yeah, we could have a long discussion on this, and I don't want to spend our time there. But let me just comment very briefly. I find Solomon to be arguably the most aggravating character in the whole Bible for that very reason. Someone who obviously contributed to the canon itself. Then again, I suppose you could say that Balaam also contributed to the canon. Though he was an unrighteous man, he was still nevertheless used as a mouthpiece for God, and for that matter, so was his donkey. Job's friends' advice constitute multiple chapters in the Bible, and yet just because they are found in the Bible doesn't mean that they have said that which is right. Although I'm looking for something in the text before I ever make that kind of a judgment that clearly says what they said was not right. So with Solomon, I wish I had clearer caveats to what he says. The fact is, Solomon wrote much more wisely than he lived. Let me put this another way. Does Proverbs provide any guidelines at all for marriage? Yeah. Okay. If you were having troubles with your marriage, would you go to a guy who had 700 wives for counseling? Does Proverbs have instructions for how to train your children? Yeah. So how did Solomon's kid, Rehoboam, turn out? He was a disaster of a king and ended up splitting the kingdom in two by listening to the foolish advice of others. So there are things about him where you think, oh, he must have not been too bad, until you read those defiant behaviors in light of Deuteronomy 17, and the fact that at his eulogy would actually say, and Yahweh was angered by Solomon. Right, that's the bottom line of his story. So I find him a very vexing character. And in fact, even the Song of Solomon, to the degree that we're thinking that this is actually a Song of Solomon, and he's singing this love song to his wife, which one? And if he were to say something like, baby, you're 1 in 1,000. It sounds really different when he says it than anybody else in all of history, right? It's supposed to be a figure of speech, by the way. Yeah. Well, yeah, even David. And let me make a quick comment on that one, because from time to time people will say, well, the Bible doesn't teach that polygamy is wrong. In fact, there's lots of passages that talk about polygamy and many characters. But we're just really bad at reading stories. We don't know how to get the point of stories. I've heard that by non-Westerners quite a bit. And John, I think it even comes out in your little expression that is a common Hawaiian one. You get together and talk story is kind of an indigenous Hawaiian thing to do. Well, they get stories. They know how to tell stories, how to listen to it over and over again, and how to understand the points. But we're not good at figuring out the point. So, okay, we have different characters in the Bible who have more than one wife. So how did it go for Abraham? It was a disaster, wasn't it? How did it go for Jacob? Oh, there was almost fratricide between the brothers. How did it go for David when he had multiple wives? No one even knew who was going to be king when he died. Is it going to be Adonijah? Is it going to be Solomon? And so there's a power struggle there. Yes, it tells stories about men having more than one wife, and not one of them ever turns out good. So, does the Bible teach that polygamy is okay? Only if you're a really stupid reader of narratives, because all the narratives tell us something otherwise. And if you want to get the pattern, just go back to Genesis chapter 2 in the HDT section. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two, not three, not five, and the two shall be one flesh. That's the pattern. And the narratives just keep reinforcing that same pattern. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts here? Sorry, I've kind of bunny trailed off different directions there. All right. What Deuteronomy 17 advocates is a designated reader. Someone who sits around all day reading Torah. The king must be a Torah scribe, writing his own copy of the document in the presence of the Levitical priests. And he must be a Torah reader, a completely obsessed and obsessive one at that, reading it in it all the days of his life. It is a daily preoccupation and a lifelong pastime. The king's incessant attention to Torah not only makes him the ideal or representative Israelite, it also secures him a lasting dynasty of designated readers, of offspring who are committed to doing the same thing. So that is the standard for the king. So again, we're still on this idea of remembering God's instructions on how to live well. And here I just want to share with you real briefly from Deuteronomy 8. Turn in your Bibles there. And this is a favorite chapter, actually, for my wife and I. It's our Thanksgiving passage. On the fourth Thursday of every November, this is the passage that I would think of most readily. Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land Yahweh promised on earth to your forefathers. Remember, there's that word, remember how Yahweh your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years to humble you and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither your fathers, you nor your fathers had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of Yahweh. Pause for just a moment. These are kind of refreshing, perspective-giving words on a day like Thanksgiving, right? Remember how he's provided and give thanks. We don't live on bread alone, or stuffing, or sweet potatoes, or pumpkin pie, or whatever else is on the Thanksgiving fare, but on every word that comes from the mouth of Yahweh. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during those 40 years. Know then in your heart, there's heart again, that as a man disciplines his son, so the Yahweh, your God, disciplines you. Verse 10. When you have eaten and are satisfied, when you're pushing yourself back from the Thanksgiving dinner table, praise Yahweh, your God, for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget, there's that phrase, Yahweh your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and decrees that I'm giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart, there's that term again, will become proud, and you will forget, there's that word, Yahweh your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He led you through that vast and dreadful desert, that thirsty and waterless land with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the desert, something that your fathers had never known, to humble and test you. Verse 17, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hand and my business degree and my instincts and savvy have earned for me, have produced for me all of this wealth. Don't be delusional. Remember Yahweh your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your forefathers, as it is today. If you ever forget, there's that term again, Yahweh your God, and follow other gods, and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will surely be destroyed. Like the nations Yahweh destroyed before you, so you will be destroyed for not obeying Yahweh your God. Just the emphasis there on when you stop and enjoy a meal, take time to remember how all of these good things became possible to begin with. And it's the gift of God for every one of us. Okay. Okay, covenant is another theme here in Deuteronomy. We've talked about it quite a bit already. Covenant obedience will be blessed. Covenant disobedience will be punished. Yahweh will keep his covenant of chesed. This is that loyalty, the fidelity. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commands. All right. And now we have one of those interruption sections, which is second verse, same as the first, more disaster, but even worse. First time around, they got 40 years of wandering. But Moses is now anticipating something that is going to be even worse than 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So let's go to, actually I've got Deuteronomy 30 here, but part of the interruption is in 29. So let's start with 29. Moses says now to this new generation, these are the terms of the covenant Yahweh commanded Moses to make with the Israelites of Moab, in addition to the covenant he had made with them at Horeb. He summoned all the Israelites and said to them, your eyes have seen all that Yahweh did in Egypt to Pharaoh, to all his officials, and to all his land. With your own eyes you saw those great trials, those miraculous signs and great wonders. But to this day Yahweh has not given you a mind that understands, or eyes that see, or ears that hear. During the 40 years that I led you through the desert, your clothes didn't wear out, nor did the sandals on your feet. You ate no bread, drank no wine or other fermented drink. I did this so that you might know that I am Yahweh your God. He then says, through Yahweh's power, you defeated several kings. Verse 9, carefully follow the terms of this covenant so that you may prosper in everything that you do. Skip down to 14. I am making this covenant with not only with you, but also with those who are not here today. And I find this a really intriguing expression because I'm not sure what he's talking about. Is he talking about this covenant is not only being made with you who are standing here, but with all succeeding generations who are not yet here on earth? Or is he perhaps even anticipating another people beyond the Israelites who would become, who would fall into line to receive the blessings of covenant relationship with God? I'll let you ponder that for a moment while I keep on going. Verse 29 of chapter 29. The secret things belonging to Yahweh our God, and the secret things, belong to Yahweh our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may follow all the words of this Torah. When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come upon you, and you take them to heart, there's that word again, wherever Yahweh your God disperses you among the nations, And when your children return to Yahweh your God and obey with all your heart, there's that term again, and with all your soul, according to everything I command you, then Yahweh your God will, we talked about this passage kind of way back, second seminar or so, he will restore your fortunes. He will bring you back from captivity. Our hearts should really be sinking at this point. Not one of them, except for Joshua and Caleb, has ever stepped foot into the land. And he's already saying, you're going to blow it. You are going to end up in captivity. Then you will repent. And then God will bring you back from captivity. Why is he even bothering to say it to these people? Because they are not his intended audience. His intended audience is hundreds of years down the road. People who find themselves in captivity. Down in the middle of verse 5, he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. Yahweh your God will circumcise the hearts, there's that term, and the hearts, once again, of your descendants, so that you may love him, there's the term again, with all your heart, there's the term again, and with all your soul, and live. And when I say that this is completely unlike ancient Near Eastern customs, other covenants, it's because of that emphasis on heart and love. And after you have broken the covenant, here's how the other party will actually treat you with favor when you repent and come back. Those are just things that you find in Deuteronomy. You're not going to find any of those other parallels. They're not even parallels. Only at the most superficial levels. Verse 19, this day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Now choose life. It really shouldn't be that hard. Which do you prefer? Frustration, futility, emptiness, loss of possessions that have distracted your heart to begin with? Or would you rather have an abundant life of joy, of peace, of love? It shouldn't be hard, but it continues to be hard for us because we don't want to get blessed by God on his terms. That's chapter 30. 31, we continue on. I'm going to skip down to verse 6. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. Because Yahweh your God goes with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. It's a familiar passage to many believers today, probably because it's quoted in Hebrews. It's initially here in Deuteronomy. And by the way, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Yahweh goes with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. All of those are repeated at the beginning of Joshua. Verse 7, halfway through. Be strong and courageous, for you must go up with this people into the land that Yahweh swore to their forefathers to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance. Yahweh himself goes before you. I and will be with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. By the way, here's an interesting little aside. And that is after they go into captivity. Well, no, let me back up first. So Moses is going to die, and there's no dynastic, that is, family tree. There's no dynastic succession for Moses. So who's the next leader of the people going to be? You know this. Joshua, okay? So Joshua is the one who's going to lead them into the land, okay? And Joshua is going to end up saying, be strong and courageous, don't be afraid or terrified. Yahweh is with you. He'll never leave you or forsake you. Okay, fast forward. Through disobedience, they end up being kicked out of the land. Eventually, after serving time in first Assyrian and then Babylonian captivity, they are now being instructed about going back to the land in a little book of Haggai. So let's turn there. And I know that that's kind of a cruel thing to do, to say to people, turn to the book of Haggai, try finding it. All right, let me give you a hint here. Go to Matthew, hang a left, and go back 3 books. Okay? Haggai chapter 2. On the 21st day of the 7th month, the word of Yahweh came through the prophet Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel. Now, Zerubbabel is the Davidic heir. He's the one who belongs on the throne of David, although they are still under now Persian rule. So he's never going to occupy that throne. He just has, in theory, the rights to it. Speak to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, to Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. So there's a high priest whose name is, how'd you pronounce this? Yeshua. Who leads them into the land the first time? Yeshua, son of Nun. Who's going to help lead the people back into the land following captivity? Yeshua. Except this time it's Yeshua, son of Jehozadak. And to the remnant of the people, ask them, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How many of you remember Solomon's temple? One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was a splendid building. Well, how does it look to you now? They've just rebuilt it. How does it look to you now? What's the second temple look like? Does it not seem to you like nothing? Compared to Solomon's temple, I mean, this looks like some Quonset hut in the backyard. But now, be strong. Where have we heard that before? Into Deuteronomy, the beginning of Yeshua, the book of Yeshua. Be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares Yahweh. Be strong, O Yeshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong to all you people of the land, declares Yahweh, and work, for I am with you. Exactly the same terminology. All right, so by now, hopefully, we're becoming more and more familiar to seeing these kinds of connections and associations when they've been living under oppression and foreign power, and he brings them out. He leads them into the land through Yeshua, and he does it again here with Yeshua, son of Jehozadak. There's a lot more to this story, but you can kind of guess what the trajectory would go. So there's going to be really no deliverance from captivity in an ultimate sense. Zechariah the next short book, is going to tell us that though they returned, their hearts are unchanged. And they're going to have to go through it yet again. And the book of Malachi says that second temple worship was awful. It was corrupt, it was self-centered, it was not pleasing to God at all. And so they remained in captivity because their hearts were unchanged. They were supposed to repent while they were in captivity, and they didn't. And so, you know how the Shekinah glory came on the tabernacle and then went into Solomon's temple? One of the most remarkable and frequently overlooked realities is that there's no indication that dwelling glory ever came to the second temple. And yet, in verse 9 here of Haggai 2, we read, "The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house," Solomon's temple, declares Yahweh. "And in this place I will grant shalom." Fast forward, there's a guy named Yeshua, son of, well, I guess you could call him Yeshua ben Yahweh, the Son of God, who's the real temple builder and covenant maker. And in his first message before his home folk back in Nazareth, he reads from Isaiah, and he says that his message is to announce the release of the captives. You see, they may have come back into the land, but they were still captive. At the end of reading of that, he sits down, everybody's looking at him, and he says, "Today, this has been fulfilled." They didn't understand it. In fact, they didn't understand so badly that they tried to stone him. And yet that's exactly what's going on in this macro structure, the meta-narrative of the Bible. Really cool stuff, isn't it? A lot more features to that. But any questions, thoughts here, Corey?
Yeah, so that Isaiah 61 passage is a lot about the year of Jubilee, correct?
Yes.
And so in thinking about the going into the land as rest, that's kind of a theology brought up by the author of Hebrews and a little bit in the Psalms. Is there anywhere like big emphasis in the Torah itself that's kind of talking about this promised rest, like entering the land, like big picture rest like that?
Well, obviously, the author of Hebrews takes us back to the 7 days of creation, and the seventh day being that of Sabbath or rest. But of course, he also identifies the people's wanderings in the wilderness as being unsettled. They were looking for a place to settle down and rest. And then the author of Hebrews goes on to say, and we too are aliens, pilgrims, living in a world system that is dominated by a hostile power. And so we, like them, are sojourning our way through this earth on our pathward toward a permanent dwelling, which would be Zion, which would be our eternal home. That will be the final rest. But there's kind of an in-between rest, and that is even while we're here in this age, we need to move into the Sabbath rest of the finished work of Christ. And it's no longer through sacrifices of animals that we can approach him, but rather through the open access that we now have in Jesus. So the rest idea, I think, is there. I don't think it's something that's as explicitly taught as in Hebrews. So we find out some things in Hebrews that we really don't anywhere else. Like, do you realize that Hebrews is the only book of the New Testament that identifies Jesus as a high priest? Now, you say there might be some inferences in the quoting of Psalm, was it 110, about Melchizedek being a king priest. Jesus ends up quoting that. But nothing explicit about Jesus being operating in the role of a priest on our behalf. Okay. Were you going to say something? Okay. All right. So, back to Deuteronomy. I just talked about the succession plan. Joshua is the one who's going to step into Moses's overly large sandals. They can't be fully filled by him, but that's what we read about in chapter 31 then. They're going to continue to rebel. Let's pick up in verse 24 of chapter 31. After Moses finished writing in a book the words of this Torah from beginning to end, he gave this command to the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of Yahweh. Take this book of Torah and place it beside the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, your God. There it will remain as a witness against you, for I know how rebellious and stiff-necked you are. If you have been rebellious against Yahweh while I'm still alive and with you, how much more will you rebel after I die? I mean, this is a very pessimistic outlook that he has on these people. Not wrong, just pessimistic. Assemble before me all the elders of your tribes and all of your officials, so that I can speak these words in their hearing and call heaven and earth to testify against them. For I know that after my death you are sure to become utterly corrupt and to turn from the way I have commanded you. B'acharit hayamim, in the last days, disaster will fall upon you, because you will do evil in the sight of Yahweh and provoke him to anger by what your hands have made. And Moses recited the words of this song, beginning to end, in the hearing of the whole assembly of Israel. So now we have a couple chapters actually, of poetry. Now, we've already talked about this when we were finding the pattern of narrative, poetry, epilogue. This is the poetry that was the HDT, the high definition or heavy duty theology of the entire Torah right here. Listen, O heavens, and I will speak. Hear, O land, the words of my mouth. So notice, he's not talking to the Israelites. We already know that he knows that none of them are listening. Why bother to address them? But more importantly, he's calling the covenant witnesses because he's going to lay a charge against them about covenant unfaithfulness. Bring in the witnesses. Let my teaching fall like rain, my words descend like dew, like showers on new grass, like abundant rain on tender plants. Verse 3, I will proclaim the name of Yahweh. Oh, praise the greatness of our God. He's the rock. His works are perfect, and his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just as he. All right. I don't know how we would, how a musical artist might render these kinds of words, but to me, this is almost anthem-like, or maybe it's a string quartet playing beautifully together, or at least a very moving song of worship in which we participate. But now look what happens in verse 5. They, on the other hand, have acted corruptly toward him. To their shame, they are no longer even his children, but a warped and crooked generation. Is this the way you repay Yahweh, O foolish and unwise people? Is he not your father, your creator, who made you and formed you? What style of music is that? Well, it's not going to be a heartfelt worship song or an anthem. What's that? Yeah, gangsta rap. Yeah, death metal. Something along that line. This is terrible stuff. Remember the days of old. Consider the generations long past. Ask your father, he'll tell you. Your elders, they'll explain it to you. When the Most High gave the Goyim, the Gentiles, their inheritance. Here I think he's referring back to the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. When he divided all Adam, all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Although there's some textual variants there that say according to the number of the sons of God. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. In a desert he found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. Let me pause here. This is a beautiful metaphor that unfortunately just gets badly handled in a number of English translations who are all translating under the influence of the King James. So my NIV says apple of his eye because the King James said apple of his eye because they didn't know how better to come up with an idiom in English to relate this. But it's actually the little man of God's eye. Well, what is the little man of God's eye? Yeah. Corey and Cassie are doing it right now. Do it again. Can you see it? Okay, they're almost nose to nose here. They're looking at each other so closely that they can see the reflection of their own face in the pupil of their most beloved one here. Isn't that great? Israel and God are supposed to be so close. They're that intimate that they can see the pupil, the face and the pupil of the other one. That's what he called them to be. He spreads out his wings to catch them. He carries them on his pinions. Yahweh alone led him. No foreign god was with him. Just talks more and more about the gloriousness of God. They, on the other hand, middle of verse 15, abandoning the God who made him, rejected the rock, his Savior. They made him jealous with their foreign gods, angered him with their detestable idols. They sacrificed to demons, which are not God. Gods they had not known, that recently appeared, that your fathers did not fear, you deserted the rock who fathered you. You forgot, there's that term again, the God who gave you birth. Yahweh saw this and rejected them. because he was angered by his sons and daughters. I will hide my face from them, he said, and see what their end will be, for they are a perverse generation. Quick word here on the term generation. When we hear generation, it's almost always, well, are you a boomer or a buster, a Z, a Y, an X, a millennial, or whatever the term might be. We think of a certain length of time and some generational differences. This is not used in that sense at all. This is generation in the sense of offspring. They are a perverse offspring. Think all the way back to Genesis 3. The seed of the woman and the seed of the snake. You understand what Moses is calling them? You guys are a perverse brood of vipers. That's right. You are the snakelings. Or if you're a Harry Potter fan, you are the Slytherins. Right? This is a perverse offspring. Children who are unfaithful. They made me jealous by what is no God, angered me with their worthless idols. I will make them envious by those who are not a people. I will make them angry by goyim that has no understanding. Who's he talking about? Who's this other Gentile people that are looked upon so favorably by God that the Jews themselves will be envious? Well, I can tell you this. Paul quotes this very verse, and he identifies it as the church. You mean to say that Moses even envisioned that God's blessings were intended for Gentile followers who would later be known as the church? I think that's exactly what we're encountering here in Hebrews. Right? In Deuteronomy, yes, I'm sorry. In Deuteronomy is where we're encountering this. Moses has got it straight, which causes then, here's where I was going with that, which causes the author of Hebrews, even Moses, to say, this is not a new plan. This was what was in mind from the very outset, that God intended to bless Adam, humanity, through the agency of the Jews. Okay? And when they end up, through their own disobedience, failing to take on their role and responsibility, then God's mercy bypasses them and goes over to these other peoples. Okay. This is powerful stuff at the end of Deuteronomy. And then we end up in chapter 34. Again, I've read through a lot of this already. Let's pick up though in verse 5 and trace it through the end. And Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there in Moab. Good place or bad place? Oh, a terrible place. As Yahweh had said, he, Yahweh, buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beit Peor. Good place or bad place? Horrible place. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died. Yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Yeshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom. Sorry, I just can't bypass this. And Jesus, Yeshua, was filled with wisdom and knowledge and favor with God and man. That's what Luke says. Yeshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what Yahweh had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face, who did all these miraculous signs and wonders Yahweh sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh, and to all his officials, and to the whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. The Torah ends with Deuteronomy 34, what I just read to you. How would you describe the effect of the ending? Is this a good ending, a bad ending, or something else? Okay, and I would like to hear from you. This is not just a rhetorical question. What do you think? Cassie?
It's not satisfying because you started the Torah thinking that it was going to maybe end up with that seed from the woman, like that there'd be someone who's like the ultimate awesome. So if Moses is the coolest person that they've seen in that day at the end of the Torah, you're just left with the people still not in their promised land, and they haven't seen anybody to take Moses' place and be better.
Yeah, this is at the very least a disappointment of our expectations. The seed from the woman has not come. The atoning substitute sacrifice for Isaac, remember the ram in the thicket? He hasn't come. The one seed from the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob hasn't come. The king that was promised to the tribe of Judah hasn't come. They have not been a blessing to all the nations, as was pronounced in the Abrahamic blessing. Not all the nations of the earth are seeking to be blessed in and through Abraham. They're not in the land, though God had promised them a land. And Moses is sick and tired of them because of their hard-heartedness, their unchanged behavior. And nothing in the last 40 years of wandering has brought them any closer to trust in Yahweh than that previous generation who balked at going into the land because of their refusal to trust in Yahweh. And then Moses dies. Boy. Yeah. Right. Right. There's no closure. There's no sense of mourning. And we don't know how he died. And you're right, he's 120 years old and still strong and good eyes and still very ambulatory and getting around just fine. And then he's dead. And we've never seen anybody like him, even down to this day.
Thank you. Are we supposed to go? Is this? I mean, is this supposed to be a response to the prophet that was to come from Deuteronomy 18? And are we supposed to be thinking that?
Yeah, so here's a couple more things that are disappointing about the end of Deuteronomy is that the king who read Torah, he hasn't come. There's no indication that any king of Judah ever copied for himself the entire Torah. I know, I'm getting around to that. And then in the very next, there's a prophet who is going to be greater than Moses, who is yet to come. And everybody, not even just the Israelites, but all people on earth will be held to account by the words of this coming prophet. He hasn't shown up. By the way, that passage is going to be, got the thing right out of the air there. just one of my Jedi moves here. Yeah. That prophet hasn't come, but he's identified in the book of Acts as being Jesus. He hasn't come. So what that means is that the promises are all still intact, but they're just not fulfilled. So is this a good ending or is it a bad ending? And I would say that it's maybe pointing in the direction of good in the future, but where it leaves us off is with the death and burial plot of a guy who was the greatest person in all of human history up to that point. So take the Torah as a whole. The Torah shows us how Adam, humanity, moved from the Garden of Eden to a cemetery plot in the plains of Moab in the valley opposite Beit Peor. How to get from point A to point bad. It's disappointing. And yet it's not hopeless. So is the Torah about the past or is it about the future? Well, it's definitely about the past. And the past part relates to the lessons that we can learn from the lives of people who persist in rebelling. It's the immovable object lessons. On the other hand, the Torah is about the future. And the future is about the irresistible force that despite all of that rebellion, God still has a plan for them. And he hasn't revoked any of those blessings for land or seed or kingdom. Amen? Yeah. So the ending, I think, points us toward the future. Yahweh's promises await a future fulfillment. The Torah, that is the Pentateuch, is forward-looking. It's eschatological. To a coming prophet, there you are, Tamara, to a coming prophet and a coming king. Right? So we can be very encouraged by this, and yet also really given a reality check. Here's what we're all like. Let me close with just a final very short quote. There was a guy who once said, God chose the Israelites because they are just like us, except more so. That is, when when they're worshiping, they are worshiping with all of their hearts. But when they are sinning, and these are his words, when they are sinning as if they invented it. We see a caricature, all of our traits just drawn larger, and hence become a really good reflecting glass into seeing ourselves. Right? It is 8:30, so let's close in prayer. Father, help us. Help us to see beyond the selfishness and just utter stupidity of trying to bless ourselves